So when we talk into sociology, you probably hear a lot of times things like systemic and structure and institutional. And we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between them and why they're important. So when we talk about the structure, we're talking about the reality that, our relationships are and interconnectedness is between our different individuals and groups and structures and systems and institutions. And when we're having that conversation, we have to really be able to hone in and narrow down into what structure actually is. So, structure is essentially the patterned arrangements in our society. What this is the things like our policies, our laws, our norms, our rules. They serve some sort of function to guide our everyday lives. And they oftentimes impact the types of cultural norms that are in place. There's different types of cultural norms that exist. You have folkways, which are the things that you should do. So, like that's something like raising your hand or lining up at a grocery store. You have your mores, which are things that are not officially informal, but they have severe consequences. So in some cultural groups, it could be like having premarital sex or having a tattoo. And then you have taboos, which are things with extreme disgust. They may or may not be something that is formal, but we have a strong reaction to it. So face tattoos historically in the United States were reacted to with a sense of extreme reaction. And Substance abuse has been one, and and sorry, cannibalism is also another taboo. Fun fact, cannibalism is actually only illegal in 2 states. Anyway, and then you have laws which are legal, formal on the books. Now, even just in these few examples I've provided, these cultural norms are dominant in the United States, but we also can see that there's like subcultures and different groups, and that norms are changed within different communities and societies. And I bring these up because the structure impacts what types of cultural norms are the norm and what is not, what is a taboo and what's not. So the structure is the larger functioning of society. And this is where we get the word systemic from, right? It's the larger systems in our society that essentially put together all the interrelated components. They incorporate some sort of process or procedure and impacts our daily lives. As sociologists, we cannot talk about structure but we actually can't talk about agency without talking about structure and how they're connected. You've probably heard the word agency, and a lot of that has to do with like your ability to make decisions, and that's true. It has a lot to do with the power and access to resources too. And what agency is essentially the individual experiences either as an individual human or an individual person or a group of people, an individual group, to be able to make choice, to make some sort of movement and choice within their own lives. And agency and structure are very closely related because agency is either empowered or disempowered by our systems and structures. And I want to make a note, though, that sometimes it can be really depressing to think about it that way. And while it is true, so for example, an individual's ability to be able to read, historically, there was an interconnection between race and literacy, not in terms of somebody's fault, but in terms of the policies and laws and who was allowed to learn and learn and be taught how to read. Or we can think about agency in terms of where people are allowed to live. So La Jolla, where our school is at, it was illegal for people of color to live there prior to the 1960s because, the conversation hadn't even gotten started until UCSD was being built. So an individual's choice to live in La Jolla was limited. Their agency to move there was limited based on the structure. So while that's true, it can be really depressing to see that. But it's important to note that while individuals' agency oftentimes is limited or encouraged by the structure, because that's where privilege comes in, right? We have to recognize that people have fought for their right to have more agency, and by not talking about that does a disservice to the movements and fights that people have done. Um, and what that does, though, is that fighting for personal agency and group agency then allows for deep structural change to take place, which we can be able to see. So agency and structure are very closely connected. Now, they are also connected to institutions. So institutions are different, but they are a part of the larger structure. So they exist within the structure, and you can think of them as parts of a whole. So if you figure like a car, right, the institution is like the engine, or it's the wheel, or it's the catalytic converter, or it's, whatever it is. The institutions are different parts, but they make up the whole system. Institutions essentially are organizational, and they fulfill some sort of role to create some sort of organization and socialize us in a way in how we interact. It helps us provide some sort of sense making to our everyday lives, but it also provides social control and coordination. Some examples of institutions in our society are the institution of the family, education, military, government, and religion. So these are all examples of institutions. Excuse me. So that brings us to the sociological imagination. And one of the things that I really want you to develop in this class is a sociological imagination as it relates to your ability to interpret data and also even just come up with the research questions that you're curious about. Some of you will go on to grad school and many of you will not. And whatever field you're in, being able to use qualitative research connected to the sociological imagination will be incredibly helpful for you and beneficial, because you'll be able to collect data and analyze it and critically think and come up with genuine innovative solutions, or at the very least important questions that can move us forward. And so the sociological imagination is coined by C. Wright Mills in 1959. It's basically where he talks about how we can have our personal troubles or private troubles, which are often individual circumstances. These things can be like joblessness or marital strain, financial mobility or lack thereof, and those are personal troubles. Nobody's dismissing those, but oftentimes they're reflective of the larger social problems, something that's in larger context. So if somebody loses their job, that's a personal trouble. But if there aren't a lot of jobs available, that becomes a social problem, right? So, marital strain or an individual experiencing some sort of domestic violence in the home is absolutely, a devastating personal struggle and issue. But we also know that in many places it's also a social problem. So what C. Wright Mills is doing is trying to explain how, like, yes, we have our personal troubles, but it's often in the context of larger social problems. It also is about how we're influenced. So one of my favorite quotes that he says in his book is that it's neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both, right? Yes, we are individuals. There's nobody that's denying that, but we cannot pretend that we don't exist within the context of history, right? Many people's existence is a very political act, a very historical act. And one of the things I'll talk a little bit about my positionality is that despite my name, despite how I look, I am part Korean. And growing up, like my grandma was born and raised in Busan, Korea. And I think a lot about how my existence, right, is the result of US imperialism. It absolutely is, right? If my grandfather hadn't been in Korea during the Korean War, and my grandmother, who was born at, the tail end of kind of everything that was happening, and they wouldn't have met. So thinking about these realities, right? And I'm not saying that's like a negative thing, nor do I want us to go down any type of rabbit holes and feel bad about our existence. That's not what I'm saying. Just that I cannot pretend that my existence is not connected to some sort of history, right? Us being in this classroom, online or otherwise, is a part of history. COVID-19 learning and teaching was a part of history, right? And all of these acts are a part of an analytical approach of the sociological imagination. He also says it's where history meets biography. And so we cannot pretend that like our biographical stories are not connected to the larger historical aspects. And, that doesn't mean that we don't have individual situations, but that we have to see how individual circumstances, that individual movie and its representation or lack thereof is reflective of a larger historical component, or, that schools, like charter schools and their existence. So there's a lot of factors that play into this sociological imagination. Now, I'm going to go over this. This is normally an exercise I do in my classes, and if you've taken a class with me, then you are familiar with this one. But I'm just going to go through and kind of talk about how we understand this and an example of using the sociological imagination. So with this, I normally present on the screen 4 cups and these, and I ask very right off the bat, what is this, right? And people normally say it's coffee or it's Starbucks. And I ask, how do you know it's Starbucks? And they say, well, the logo, it's internationally recognized, right? And this is true. It is an internationally recognized logo. And my very first question after that is, what is that logo? And I'll pause, let you think for a minute. So if you said that logo was a mermaid, that is incorrect. The logo is actually a siren. So the siren, if you're unfamiliar with her in lore, is this beautiful, well, she sings a beautiful song and lures with the and presents beautifully at first to lure sailors to their deaths. And it's an interesting representation if you think about what the siren's role is and the way that coffee and caffeine and commercialism kind of allures you in, right? So that's kind of the very first part that we could start thinking about. How do we know it's coffee? Well, it's a typical type of coffee cup that we're socialized to understand as coffee. It's for hot drinks. It's these are it's likely holidays. We ask how, well, because it says Merry Coffee, right? Merry Coffee. Well, we know Merry is a part of Merry Christmas, which is the dominant Christian holiday in the United States. So we know that this has been socialized us to recognize these power dynamics, right, around religious kind of orientation and perspectives in the United States. Well, what else do we know about this? Well, we can also think about Starbucks as an international company and how they can go in and like wipe out small businesses. So that has economic implications. We also know that there's a lot of labor busting and labor union organizing taking place, which tells us that labor values and are not valued really by Starbucks, while also recognizing that people are being exploited. We also know that coffee represents some sort of energy, right? Coffee is caffeine and caffeine is for energy. So thinking about the sociological imagination, we go in and get our cup of coffee. We go through the drive-through because we're really tired. We get our cup of coffee because, we stayed up the night before, having to work a lot, having to, crank out that assignment, having to go to your job. And so you wake up, you get your cup of coffee for that energy boost, you pay the barista, off you go to work your job to make that boss a bunch of money so you can go to school, so that way you can have a decent life. And then you go home and you go to sleep and you wake up, you have a cup of coffee, rinse and repeat, right? And that may look like an individual struggle because you're really tired, but then you also have to think about the barista. So you paid that barista, the barista gave you your latte. The barista has health insurance, great, but they can't use it probably because they have to work so much themselves. They made minimum wage plus a few tips, which the tips are now the responsibility of the consumer, though. And yet, some big CEO made bank up there at Starbucks not and that barista did not make what they just did, right? They did not make the actual labor that they had. Meanwhile, Starbucks is purchasing these beans from other countries, ravaging their resources, not actually paying them sustainable wages for their beans or sustainable pay for their beans, even though they're supposedly part of fair trade. But if you actually look at it and you do the math, it's really not a part of fair trade. And then that community now has fewer resources, and they're probably living in poverty because of US imperialism. And not necessarily that person, but because, different dynamics and such. And they don't have the resources. There was also like, just as an example, when quinoa was a huge thing a couple of years back, people were talking about how, yeah, sure, it was sustainable to some extent, but what was happening is that the people who actually were harvesting it were the ones who used that the most, and they now didn't have access to one of their prime harvest and food sources. So thinking about that, right? Going back to Starbucks, we're thinking about how these interconnections are crucial to recognize, and using the sociological imagination looks at that. And what that is reflective of is an economic structure that's rooted in exploitation of work and labor. And in turn, it becomes this vicious cycle. And meanwhile, what we can look at that picture is it's just a coffee cup, right? It's obviously for marketing purposes, but we have to think about the larger implications of that. Okay, so when we think about the sociological imagination and how it informs our research, we have to talk about some philosophical foundations. Before I go into that, this lecture, because it is relatively long, I'm going to have 2 different code words. The very first code word is going to be butterfly. So the very first code word is butterfly. The second code word will come a little bit later. So again, that very first code word is butterfly. Okay, so when we going back now to research, we have to recognize that research has its origins in philosophical foundations and philosophy. Sorry, I'm going to go forward a little bit real fast. Okay, and I bring this up, it's not in here, but I bring this up because I'll probably revisit this a little bit in more detail, but the scientific method is something that we learn really young. Like my children are just finished grades 4 and 6, and they were learning the scientific method in grades 4, and that is basically where you come up with a problem and you come up with a hypothesis, and then you collect your data, and then you evaluate it, and then you readjust and stuff. And that's essentially what we do is we, excuse me, utilize the scientific method. And science is rooted in philosophy, right? If you think about the Pythagorean theorem, that comes from a philosopher named Pythagoras. So we have to think about like philosophy and its role in informing research methods. And so there's a couple concepts that you're going to need to understand and kind of grasp, because this influences the types of questions that you ask as well. So the very first one is ontology. Ontology, or your ontological belief or ontological foundation, is essentially what we believe to be true. Ontology basically makes us think about, what do we believe to be true and what is the purpose? What is our nature? Do we believe in truth big T or truth little t? And the reason, what I mean by that is that truth big T is that there's a universal truth. There's a singular truth or singular outcome that we're seeking, while truth little t is not. Truth little t is a truth that has to do with more, that there are multiple truths that can exist. An ontological belief in the truth big T is positivism. And with that, that tends to be rooted more in quantitative research. And truth little t is constructivism. Things are constructed, and that has to do with more of a qualitative approach. Now, I bring that up because epistemology has to do with how we learn that. So if your ontological belief is positivism, that's going to influence what epistemological approach you take. So ontology is what you believe. So that's positivism and constructivism. Epistemology is, now that I know what I believe, how do I find that out? How do we seek that truth, right? How do we understand more about that and what we believe? And this is what's found in our methodology. Now, your ontology is often found in both your research question and your theoretical framework, because you're explaining the social phenomenon of what you believe to be true. Meanwhile, epistemology is often found in your methodology, because this is, how do we seek that truth? How do we find that out and learn more? So if your ontological belief or your ontology is positivism, your epistemological approach is going to be quantitative. If your ontological belief is truth little t, that's constructivism, your epistemology or epistemological approach is going to be qualitative. So we're in the qualitative class, and that means that when you write your research questions, your ontology is going to have to be rooted in a constructivist approach. And this comes up in the types of research questions that we develop. And I'm going to give you some more examples. I'm going to give you an example in a second, but I want to cover real fast what axiology is. Axiology has to do with morals. Like, what do we believe to be moralistic? What do we believe to be right or wrong? And how is this going to influence our research? Do we believe that participants should be mere participants, like in the sense that we just ask them questions and then we collect their data? Or do we believe that it should be a collaborative environment? So axiology is going to help influence and inform what types of research, morals, and ethics we engage in, beyond just kind of what the traditional ethics are. So going back to this, research questions, if your ontological belief, your question was more positivist, your research question might be something like, what are the graduation rates in San Diego high schools, right? And the reason why this is truth be told is you're not looking for the whys or the whats. You're looking for just simply that outcome. What is that? What is the graduation rates? And that epistemology would be a quantitative approach, because you're just doing some sort of quantitative data analysis, right? You're collecting quantitative data numbers and you're analyzing it. However, ontological belief of constructivism might influence a question to look more like what family factors play a role in in San Diego high school graduates' ability to graduate, or what family factors play a role in in San Diego high schoolers' beliefs around high school graduation. So you see that that's asking, like that's recognizing that things are can be very vast, different experiences are there. It's looking at the social construction of life, and that's more of a qualitative approach.
Within sociology, we also need to talk a lot about the different theories that exist and how they help us explain social phenomenon and what they are. So, sociological theory in general is a way for us to think about our ontology and it describes phenomenon. The reason that this is important with like the philosophical foundations and how one would conduct research is that that's where theory comes from. Theory comes from research and observations about the world uh, and our philosophical underpinnings, pave the way for sociological theory, whether it's the recreation of theory or it's the utilization of theory. In sociology, there are three major theories. We have structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. Um, Structural functionalism and conflict theory are what's called macro level theories, while symbolic interactionism is micro level theory. That does not mean it only analyzes smaller scale, but or like individual situations, but it's smaller scale interactions. So structural functionalism and conflict theory are looking at the overarching kind of mechanisms of society, while symbolic interactionism is looking at the smaller, symbolic meanings, cultural transmission, and knowledge. Um, Structural functionalism is the theory that looks at how our system functions. If it exists, it has a function. Basically, if poverty exists, it has a function and it's to motivate you. If prisons exist, there's a function and it's to rehabilitate. Right. But one of the other elements of this of structural functionalism, though, is that if it exists, it has a function. So why would you protest against it? Structural functionalism is very much that it is the individual's responsibility to make society function. And that is the pitfall of society is if we don't fulfill our roles and expectations, then in turn it causes dysfunction. Um, it is one of the biggest reasons why if people are protesting, folks have this kind of reaction. It's like, why would you protest that? Why would you say something against that? Because if the system exists and if it functions and if it works, why would you protest against it? Um, it is the dominant lens in which society looks at things. I don't mean individuals like you and I necessarily, but I mean society as a whole. Conflict theory looks at larger things as larger structure as well, but it looks at it a little differently in that it's looking at how conflict is embedded in our society, and it's this constant struggle, this constant power struggle. And I just want to revisit these a little bit. If this is like one of the first sociology classes you've taken, or it's been a while since you've taken a class, and everybody's at a different point in their journey. So I'm just doing a quick refresher of this as opposed to a deeper dive. So just bear with me. So conflict theory, um, again, is the idea that there's conflict embedded in our society, and it's this power struggle between those who have and those who have not, the capitalist and the working class, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariats. Um, and conflict theorists look at how this unequal balance is not okay. Structural functionalism and conflict theory can both look at the same thing but analyze it differently. So it's like a set of lenses that you put on. Symbolic interactionism is a smaller scale analysis. It does look at it from an equity lens. It is looking at things from an equitable perspective, but it is smaller scale. So it's how do we learn the things we learn, the social meanings that we develop, the social construction. So one of the things I always use is the middle finger. We know what the middle finger is, right? And the middle finger is something that will induce extreme reaction from people sometimes. That does, and they will, if they become angry, that is a real physiological reaction. But that physiological reaction is in response to the social meaning that we've developed and for the finger. If the finger instead meant hello and we're throwing middle fingers around instead to say hi to people, it might induce a level of joy or happiness, right? So symbolic interactionism is looking at the meanings in which we create in our society, and how that shapes our perspectives of things. Another example is that within education, how people are sorted into different groups or categories for reading or for math. Students oftentimes know what those mean and have internalized those messages. And symbolic interactionists look at that. So let's get into now social problems and private troubles. So you have a reading by C. Wright Mills who differentiates them and explains them. And private troubles impact all of us. We all have private troubles, right? And one of the key elements of the sociological imagination, though, and understanding how to differentiate between a private trouble and a social problem, is within that reading, and we can break down the differences between them. So one of the key elements of social problem is that it's something that affects our public at large. So, for example, if you are in a society where, or like in a community where jobs are not hard to come by, you can easily get a well-paying job. Um, just hypothetically, but you happen to not have a job, right? That becomes a private trouble because you're struggling with it. And that's not to undermine the private trouble at all. It's instead to recognize that it may not be a social problem, it's more of a private trouble. Um, but if everybody in your community is struggling to get a job, right, that becomes a social problem. So essentially, the difference between them is it a larger problem at hand that society is seeing as unfavorable, right? Society is seeing that it is causing an issue within society, or is it just affecting a few people? That doesn't mean we can't help people. That doesn't mean we can't, support each other. That's not what that's saying. But the difference is whether we define it as a social problem or not. Social problems are dependent upon culture, time, and place. So, what we determine, what we believe about one culture being a social problem may actually not be seen as a social problem for them. Um, and that's significant when we're thinking about how to define it and how to not um, provide a colonizing perspective and analysis of it, because sometimes what we may decide in the United States as a social problem may not be seen as a social problem, and vice versa. What a community may be seen as a social problem, we may not. That doesn't mean it's not a social problem, but it does mean that we may not be viewing it that way. Now, some sociologists don't recognize social problems, though, as a social problem, until it's recognized by policymakers or those in positions of power. I think this is where it becomes a little tricky because when I first heard that, it made me really frustrated because my thought was like, well, just because a policymaker doesn't see it doesn't mean it's not a problem. And that is true. But I think what separates that is that it's not a defined social problem. So social problem has particular elements that are recognized and different stages and steps. Um, and it can change over time. So a good example would be cars. So now, right, we know that even though pedestrians have the right of way in many cases, right, they have sidewalks while people who are driving cars have roads. There's lights and stop signs, but before that wasn't the case. So a lot of those changes didn't take place until people were being hit as pedestrians, as cars were emerging more, as the use of cars were emerging. So that's a good example of how, walking, like not having rules and laws for driving didn't become a social problem until people recognized it was a social problem. And then they made that change. So being able to differentiate between the social problem and the private trouble is something that I'm hoping that you can develop over time for this class. So before I get into this, I want to share a code word with you, and the code word is fan. The code word is fan. Okay, so when we're thinking about social problems, we have to understand history. So history really shapes and reshapes social problems. Some argue that because it was in the past, it's not a problem today. And while that's, I guess, technically true, right? That is technically true because if it was a problem then, it may not be a problem now. We can't pretend that those problems don't impact today. So thinking about the sociological imagination, and something I always share is that who you are today, right, is impacted by who you were last year. Sometimes we might want to think that new year, new me, right? Cool. But who we are on January 1st is shaped by who we were the year before. And that was by the year before and by the year before. And all of the social elements, right, culminate to who we are and the time and place in which we're existing. Um, so I think we need to be careful when we have that mentality that while that may be true, and what we see today as a social problem may not have been a social problem then either, we need to be careful with how we're doing this analysis, right? So one of the crucial elements is that society also must identify a situation, condition, or behavior as a problem. Um, and one of the questions I want to ask is like, how do we weave the concepts of power into this, right? So power is not solely about individuals. We have to look at how that is distributed in society. So I really want you to kind of think about that is when you're doing your readings and when we're finishing this lecture and you're starting to conceptualize these elements, how do we weave the understanding of power into this? And how does that look in terms of awareness, right? So one of the elements of a social problem is that there has to be some sort of awareness of it. So speaking about it, discussing it, and attempting to address it. Fuller and Myers say that a social problem is something is a situation that's deemed as a deviation from the ideal social norms, while Reinhardt says that this is it's a condition that has serious consequences and can be handled by society. And I think those are important, especially with the condition that we see today in society, because the reality is that there are a lot of things that we can handle, but we are told that we can't. At the same time, there's a lot of things that we see how, for example, actually the economic system and structure is a good example of that. We see that people are being, priced out of homes. People can't have to have like a ton of roommates. Things are escalating, but we're not making enough noise about it. So even though this is a great example, actually, because even though it could be seen as a social problem, policymakers aren't seeing it, right? Fuller and Myers would say that that is a deviation from ideal social norms, right? And so then in turn, it is a social problem. But because nobody's addressing it and nobody's doing anything about it, it is something with serious consequences, right? And we can handle it, but we're not doing it. So the policymakers not seeing it, is it a social problem if there isn't this heightened awareness and action toward it? Now, have those kind of thoughts as you're moving forward. So we're going to talk a little bit about the stages of social problems as well. One is the emergence and claims making. So this means that there's some sort of attention to a condition or behavior and people are making claims. Not a lot, but sometimes social problems and movements stop at this because not all efforts are successful, right? They're just making the claims. It's called claims making. Because people are just making the claim saying that this is a problem, these are some issues that are at hand. The next step is legitimacy. So now that there's some more attention, it's turning into the social problem. There's some sort of action to address it. And the idea is that now you're using peer-reviewed research and empirical evidence. Well, not necessarily peer-reviewed research. A lot of times in academia, that's the case, but you are using empirical evidence to say that this is a problem. You're trying to convince those in positions of power that this is a legitimate issue. You're adding legitimacy to it. Then you have the renewed claim section, which is reasserting those claims. Sometimes you'll see that even though in steps 1 and 2, policymakers maybe or institutional leaders see that there's a problem, then there isn't a lot being done. This is where a lot of criticism comes up, criticism of officials, right? You're starting to reassert these claims and say, okay, these issues are still at hand. And a lot of times this is where you'll see tension rise. There's now then you go into step 4, which is the stage 4, which is the development of alternative strategies. This is where a lot of times people see that things are not being done. So people a lot of times develop their own strategies to address these social problems significantly. So now these are some reactions to social problems. This is not saying that this is every reaction, but these are more of the common reactions that we see. One is this kind of unbothered and not concerned. So it's the idea that if it doesn't impact somebody, people are indifferent, right? A lot of times, private troubles and individual struggles are overriding the view of these systemic issues. Um, if a lot of times with this particular indifference, if their interests become involved, they will start taking an interest. But a lot of times people are indifferent if they don't feel like they're impacted. Another reaction is this idea of fatalism. So it's that destiny is dictating the outcomes. It's destiny, it's fate, right? It sometimes it's a matter of misfortune, or it's karma, which is a misunderstanding of that word. But because of the idea of fatalism, it's also means that there's no harm in doing nothing, because if the outcome is already fixed, why would you? There's also vested interest. So if the problem exists, some groups of people may actually have something to gain or benefit from that. Or if they have something to lose, their self-interest guides it. So it's vested interest. And then there's also this absence of expert knowledge. So a lot of people do care deeply, but they believe that people don't have enough knowledge to make some sort of change. Um, and this absence of expert knowledge can sometimes cause a reaction because people don't quite know what to do, or they feel like they don't know what to do, or they feel like people don't know what to do, right? They don't have enough knowledge to actually make some sort of change. So these are some of the concepts and reactions to social problems that you may see exist as well. Um, the next code word is light, Light, light. So when we're addressing social problems, I really want us to hold on to this idea of intersectionality and what it is and how we can weave things together. So the first thing I want to note is that these issues don't exist and cannot exist within silos when we're analyzing them. Our module one does use an intersectional lens in that I'm hoping we can see that education as, not education as a social problem, but the education system and social problems within it, and weaving together elements of racism and poverty. Uh, so education has a lot of issues, or let me rephrase that: the schooling system has a lot of issues. Education can be formal or informal, but our education system is more of a formal system. And there are a lot of issues in the United States, but on a global level as well. So when we're looking at these elements, I really want us to adopt an intersectional perspective, though. And so intersectionality is a phrase that you have probably heard. Um, but with that, I want to go over it because sometimes it's reduced to just, oh, I can list my identities. But that's not what it is. Intersectionality is the layers that cannot be teased apart, right? So I identify as a woman, but I also identify as disabled, and I also identify as a mother, and I also I can see I also identify as first generation, right? All of those elements make me who I am, and I cannot tease them apart, right? Because how I navigate the world, those are all how I navigate the world is dependent upon all of those layers. And that navigation will look differently depending on which systems and structures and communities I'm in. Um, I and there's a lot of different factors that we can play into that. So for example, with those identities, I also am white presenting, but I also identify with my Korean background, right? So I can recognize that I will have um, privileges in some areas, but also have generational trauma, and that there are cultural elements that are very closely tied to me, that I could get into, but I'm not going to get into deeply right this second. So all of these elements make me who I am, and how I navigate the world is dependent upon those, right? And then you can just add on the layers, and you see that you can't tease them apart, and they are connected to power within our systems and structures. So intersectionality, though, initially is coined in '89 by civil rights activist and critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. She is looking at the dimensions of race and gender, and she says that it's not enough to just talk about how women are navigating this legal system, but we have to look at gender and race. Patricia Hill Collins continues on to that work, and she, within Black feminist thought, and over time, she's done a lot of additional work where she says that it's not enough, right? We have to look at race, gender, class, ethnicity, and all of these structural issues, right? We can think about disability, religion, ethnicity, because ethnicity and race are different, language, right? These are all different factors that play a role in how we navigate the world. And McCall says intersectionality should be looked at as like the relationship among multiple dimensions and modalities of social relationships and subject formation. So essentially looking at how people have different dimensions, different layers, right? And different types of relationships, right? You have your personal relationships, and then there's institutional relationships, right? You have all of these elements and how our identity formulates and how our society forms together. So continuing on this, I want to think about how like feminist theory plays a role into this. So bell hooks, for instance, looks at how we can look at gender, right? But a lot of times white women end up in positions of power, and that ends up like shedding the light only on one element, which is just simply a matter of looking at race. And in this case, we're looking at how these positions of power can reshape our understanding of our social structures and systems. Um, there's also this idea of general oppression theory. So looking at how there's no hierarchy of oppression. Um, and you may have heard it as the oppression Olympics. It's just what people have said. It can be um, people use that in the wrong ways as well. But the idea is that all oppression is interconnected. Now, that does not mean that when there's a movement that we just go, ugh, because it's not looking at all of the elements of oppression, because there's a lot of elements of oppression, but oppression is maintained by power. And Brand says that what happens a lot of times is that there's this huge emphasis on changing these things, but it leaves the basic structures intact while giving the appearance of change. And so, what I'm trying to kind of explain within this intersectionality perspective is that all oppressions are interconnected, right? It is a system of oppression within power, and we have to look at how. Yes, sometimes we do need to look at singular identities in certain situations, but nonetheless, look at how we see things differently. So when this link here, I'm not going to go through it, but I do highly encourage you to click on it. It's Audre Lorde who says, "Who said it was simple?" And she's talking about protests. And Audre Lorde identified as a Black lesbian woman. And so she explains how she cannot see causes or social problems within only one perspective, right? She sees them in all of these perspectives of who she is. So I do highly encourage you to read that poem, um, uh, to break that apart and just kind of sit with it for a little bit. Okay. Um, the last code word, typically we won't have this many code words, just to let you know, but it'll be a random number, an amount, but the code word for this one, this last code word is passport, passport. Okay, so I really, this is a lecture that kind of covers some foundation, and so I want you to think about some of these elements tied in with the readings and materials that you're watching and viewing. So a couple things to think about within this is that education is closely connected, right, to all of us. We're in an education setting right now, and we can see that on a historic level, education has faced issues around racism, right, and representation in the curriculum. Literacy rates are a social problem. How people teach, teaching styles haven't changed on a wide scale level for a very long time. Access and opportunity, right? So thinking about access to college and higher education, one thing I always talk about is that education cannot be a tool of equity until admissions processes are gone. It ends up, feeding into this narrative of competition and competition being the only way out. And so long as you have to compete against people, it leaves people out. Um, So thinking about that, right? One of the only requirements for learning more should be a desire to learn more. But thinking about access and opportunity and the standardized testing that you do, or the access to resources in your K-12 experiences, which ties into poverty and the economy, right? So there's a lot of elements that we have to look at how the social and historical elements have contributed to a lot of these issues in education. We can think about, how education really does uphold a dominant cultural identity, right? Of whose culture is being represented the most. And then the interconnection between race, socioeconomic status, and education within the United States. Um, when when we go forward, there's a lot of foundational stuff we have to cover. I will go into details with like numbers and ideas and thoughts. But for this first week, I really want you to kind of soak in the materials that are being that you have to read and watch, and really start exercising your own sociological imagination as you're bringing these things together. Some of the biggest questions I really want to ask is, how do you see the role of power within the definitions of social problems, and what do you see is a social problem within your community, within your neighborhood, within larger society?